Please put a like and subscribe. Rebbe Nachman spoke and said, "While on my journey I told a story. Whoever heard it wanted to come closer to Hashem." This is the story. There was once a king who had 6 sons and 1 daughter. His daughter, the princess, was a very special, and her father loved her very much. He always enjoyed her company. One day, while they were alone together, the king became angry with his daughter. "May the evil one take you," he cried, although he didn't really mean it. That night, the princess went to her room, but in the morning, she was gone. No one knew where to find her. Her father was very upset and went looking for her everywhere. Now, the king had a viceroy who was his closest friend and advisor. Seeing that his master was very upset, the viceroy approached the king and asked him for a servant, a horse, and some money for expenses. Then he went off and searched for the lost princess. He searched and searched for a very long time, until at last he found her. This is the story of his adventures. On his journey, the viceroy traveled through deserts and fields and forests. He searched for a very long time. Finally, while traveling through the desert, he came upon a narrow path leading away from the main road. "I've traveled for so long in the desert and still haven't found a princess," he thought to himself. "Why don't I try this path? Maybe it will lead me back to where there are people." The viceroy kept traveling until at last he came to a very beautiful castle. All around it were many soldiers. They looked most impressive as they stood guard at their different posts. At first, the viceroy was afraid the soldiers wouldn't let him enter, but he thought it over and decided to try anyway. "Let's see what happens," he said. The viceroy left his horse behind and walked up to the gates of the castle. To his surprise, the soldiers didn't bother him at all. He walked right into the main building and went from room to room without anyone saying a word. Finally, the viceroy came to the great hall. There, sitting on the throne, was the king. He was surrounded by his ministers and servants and many soldiers. The viceroy saw all sorts of guests and musicians playing their instruments. It was all very beautiful. He also saw tables set with tons of foods and helped himself to whatever he wanted. But as before, no one seemed to notice him. So the viceroy went to lie down out in the corner to see what would happen. After a while, the king commanded his servants to bring in the queen. While the orchard played and many people sang, the queen approached. There was a great uproar throughout the hall. A second throne was brought and placed next to the king, and the queen sat down. The viceroy recognized her immediately. She was the lost princess. And when the queen saw the viceroy laying in the corner, she recognized him too. The queen stood up and went over and touched him. "Do you know me?" she asked. "Yes," the viceroy replied. "I know you. You are the king's lost daughter. But how did you get here?" "It happened when my father said that the evil one should take me," she explained. "This is the place of evil." The viceroy told the princess that her father was heartbroken and that he had been looking for her for many years. "How can I get you out of here?" he asked. The only way for you to free me is if you choose a special place and stay there for a whole year. All that year, whenever you have time, you must only learn and look forward to freeing me. You also fast and on the last day on the year, you must go without eating and sleeping for an entire 24 hours, she explained. The Viceroy went and did just what the princess said. He found a quiet place and sat there every day for a whole year, yearning to set her free. On the last day of the year, he fasted and did not sleep. Then he stood up and began walking back to the castle. Along the way, he saw an apple tree with very beautiful apples. It was almost impossible not to look at the fruit because they looked so delicious. Unable to control himself, the Viceroy plucked an apple from the tree and took a bite. As soon as he swallowed it, he fell to the ground in a deep, deep sleep and slept a long, long time. The Viceroy's servant tried to wake him, but he couldn't. When the Viceroy finally opened his eyes, he didn't know what had happened. "Where in the world am I?" he asked. The servant told him everything that had happened. "You slept for a very long time, for many years. You survived by eating these fruit." The Viceroy was very upset. He went to the castle and found the princess. She was also heartbroken. "If only you had come here on that day, you would have freed me," she cried. "But because of that one day, you lost everything. Yet the truth is that it is very hard not to eat, especially on that last day when the evil argue is very strong. Now you must find yourself a place all over again and stay there for another year. This time, you are permitted to eat on the last day. Just do not go to sleep. Do not drink any wine either, so that you will not fall asleep. Remember, the main thing is to stay awake." Again, the Viceroy followed all the princess's instructions. On the last day of the year, he started walking back to the castle and came upon a flowing spring. It was deep red and smelled like wine. "Do you see this?" he asked the servant. "This is a spring, which should contain water, but it is red and smells like wine." The Viceroy went down and took a taste from the spring, and he immediately fell asleep. This time he remained asleep for 70 years. After a while, a great number of soldiers came. Their wagons loaded with provisions and equipment. The servant hid in fear as they passed. Then a beautiful carriage accompanied by several wagons came along. When they were right beside the Viceroy, the procession stopped. The carriage door opened and out stepped the princess. Walking over to the sleeping man, she sat down next to him and tried her best to wake him up, but the Viceroy remained fast asleep. "It is so sad," the princess sighed. "You have tried so hard and worked for many years to set me free, and then on the last day you missed your chance." She began to weep bitterly. "It is a very great pity," she said, "both of me and for you. I have been here for such a long time, and still I cannot leave." The princess took her scarf from her head and wrote on it with her tears. When she finished, she placed it next to the Viceroy. Then the princess stood up and returned to her carriage, and the wagons disappeared. When the Viceroy finally woke up, he asked his servant, Where in the world am I?" The servant told him everything that had happened, how many troops had passed by accompanying a beautiful carriage. He described how the woman had wept over the Viceroy and how she had said that it was a great pity for him and for her. The Viceroy then noticed the scarf lying next to him. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "The woman left it here after writing on it with her tears," the servant replied. The Viceroy held the scarf up into the sun. The Viceroy began to make out the letters and read the message left by the lost princess. In it, she described her great sorrow and grief. She also said that she was no longer in the castle. Now he would have to search for the Golden Mountain and the Pearl Castle. He would find her there. The Viceroy left his servant behind and went off alone to find the princess. He traveled for many more years. Since he had studied maps all over the lands in the world, he knew that the Golden Mountain with the Pearl Castle did not exist in any place where people lived. Therefore, he decided to continue his search in the desert. Many years, the Viceroy wandered in the desert in search for the princess. Finally, he met a huge man. This giant was so big that he could not be considered a human. He was carrying an enormous tree. There was not another tree like this in the forest where people usually go. "Who are you?" the giant asked. "I am a human being," the Viceroy replied. "That's interesting," the giant said in amazement. "I never saw a human being here before." The Viceroy told him the whole story and that now he was looking for the Golden Mountain and the Pearl Castle. "Someone has been filling your head with fairy tales," the giant laughed. "There's no such a thing as a Golden Mountain or a Pearl Castle." The Viceroy began to cry. There is, he insisted. "In my opinion, this is more foolishness," the giant said. "But since you are so determined, I will do something for you. I am in charge of all the animals on earth. I will call them together. The animals roam all over the world. Maybe one of them knows something about the mountain and castle." The giant summoned all sorts of animals, large and small. "Have you seen a Golden Mountain or a Pearl Castle?" he asked. The animals all answered that they had never seen them. "See," he told the Viceroy, "people have told you foolish stories. Listen to me and go home. You will never find this Golden Mountain and Pearl Castle, but they don't exist." Still, the Viceroy would not give up. "They do exist, I'm sure of it. I have a brother who also lives here in the desert," the giant said. "He is in charge of all the birds. Maybe they know something. They fly high in the air and may have seen such a mountain and castle. Go to my brother and tell him I sent you." The Viceroy traveled on and on for many years. Then one day the Viceroy met a giant like the first one. This giant too was carrying an enormous tree. The giant questioned the Viceroy and heard the story of his adventures. The Viceroy also mentioned that the giant's brother had sent him here. However, the second giant also tried to discourage him. "This Golden Mountain and Pearl Castle do not exist," he said. "Oh yes they do," the Viceroy insisted. "I am in charge of the birds," the giant said. I will call them together for you. Maybe they know something. The second giant called all the birds, large and small, and asked every one of them. But none of the birds knew any such mountain or castle. The giant told the viceroy, "Can you see that these things don't exist anywhere in the world? Listen to me and go home." "No," said the viceroy, "somewhere they do exist." Seeing that the viceroy's mind was made up, the giant said, Further on the desert, you will find my other brother. He is in charge of the winds. They blow all over the world. Who knows? Maybe they know about the Golden Mountain and Pearl Castle." The viceroy kept traveling for many more years until he met another giant. Like the first two, he was also carrying an enormous tree. The third giant asked questions like his brothers, and again the viceroy told his story. The giant too tried to discourage him, but the viceroy would not give up. "For your sake, I will gather all the winds together," the giant said. "Let's see if they have heard of a golden mountain and a pearl castle." He summoned them, and in a great gust, all the winds came. But when he asked them about the mountain and the castle, none of the winds knew anything. "Don't you see that people have told you some foolish fairy tales?" the giant asked. The viceroy began to weep bitterly. "I am sure that they exist. I am sure of it," he cried. Just then, another wind arrived. The giant was very angry with it. "Why didn't you take so long to come?" he demanded. "I commanded all the winds to come here. What's your excuse?" "I was delayed," the wind answered. "I had to carry a royal princess to a golden mountain and a pearl castle." "You see," the viceroy cried out with great joy, "they really do exist." "Tell me," the giant asked the wind, "what sort of things are expensive there?" "Oh, everything is expensive there," the wind replied. The giant in charge of the winds then said to the viceroy, "You have been seeking the princess for such a long time, and you have done everything you can to find her. Still, you may have difficulty because of money. I am therefore giving you a special money pouch. Whenever you put your hand into it, you will find as much money as you need." The giant then ordered the wind that they carry the lost princess to take the viceroy to the Golden Mountain and Pearl Castle. The mighty wind carried the viceroy right to the gates of the city on top of the Golden Mountain. At first, the soldiers did not want to let him in, but the viceroy took some money from his pouch and paid them to open the gates for him. The city was very beautiful. The viceroy walked about until he met a rich man, from whom he returned a place to eat and sleep. The viceroy realized that he would have to stay there a while, for it would take the greatest wisdom to come up with a plan to finally free the princess. Again, he was so near, so near. Rebbe Nachman never finished telling the story of how the viceroy rescued the princess. The end.